Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by John Kiriakou, a good friend and colleague of the show. You've seen him on here before. And let me fix a little technical glitch. Okay. Yeah. So it's really good to have you, John. Thanks for joining.
Happy to do it, Kevin. Thanks for inviting me.
And I know before I get going, just up top, let me do a couple housekeeping things for my channel, just so that people know. If you're just stumbling on us for the first time, this is the newsletter that I do. I just did a piece on the lawsuit against alleged CIA spying on people who visited Assange, which you can go read, and we'll be discussing that today. And then, of course, just take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you know when we're having great conversations like this with people who we bring on. So now I can get back to why you're here. And I'm actually going to do a little diversion before we really get to what we plan to. I told everybody we're going to talk about. I've been waiting for a long time. The response to this, what were these journalists and attorneys that visited Assange, what were they going to say in response to the CIA and former CIA director Mike Pompeo to try to keep their lawsuit alive and argue that they should have a day in court to say their privacy rights were violated? But I got to ask you first. We only have one source at the moment, but is Donald Trump going to be indicted under the Espionage Act? I mean, I can barely get that out without laughing because it just seems unbelievable. But I'll go ahead and put on the screen here, although it's loaded with advertisements and just doesn't generally look that pleasing to the eyeballs. But here on The Independent is the only source right now with this. So it's kind of bizarre. You would expect CNN or maybe the New York Times or someone else to have a story. But right now, there's one news report, and it says that the DOJ, the Department of Justice, will be asking a grand jury to indict Donald Trump for violating the Espionage Act and for obstruction of justice as soon as Thursday. And that they're ready to ask to approve an indictment under Section 793, which you know yourself from your experience with your case and all these other Espionage Act cases. And that, they're going to say something. They even have language. I mean, someone's actually like outright leaking the indictment to whomever. If this is real, lawfully, anyone who lawfully having possession of access to control over or being entrusted with any document relating to the national defense. Okay, they're just reading the Espionage Act code there. And then there's apparently, the other thing that's really important here is that apparently Mark Meadows is involved in some degree, and that he's going to be given some limited immunity in exchange for testimony and possibly even plead to like lesser offenses so that he, as part of his agreement to not have a more serious case brought against him. Now, let me just take this down. I have no idea if any of this is real at the moment, but just going off of this, what are your thoughts?
Well, like you, I don't know if it's real. I actually hope that it's not real for a couple of reasons. First, this would be a ratcheting up of political warfare in the United States that we haven't seen ever in American history. I mean, it's one thing to threaten prosecution for something like Watergate, where Richard Nixon was threatened with prosecution, and 12.5 people involved in the Watergate burglary got between like 6 months and 18 months in prison. But the Espionage Act, I wrote a piece about, I'm going to say it was probably 6 or 8 months ago for Consortium News, in which I said that, I think the way they entitled it was Donald Trump should not be charged with espionage. And then underneath the subtitle was, and neither should anybody else. I feel very strongly about that. And in fact, just today, in a presentation that Jesselyn Radack Jeffrey Sterling and I did for Human Rights Con in Costa Rica, we all said the same thing. None of us like Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump was a disaster as president, one of the worst presidents in American history. But my God, the Espionage Act is worse for the country than anything Donald Trump ever did. You know, Kevin, you and I have talked about this a 1,000 times over the years. The Espionage Act was written in 1917 to combat German saboteurs during the First World War. It was never meaningfully updated. Technically, it was updated in the early 90s, but they were just, like I say, technical tweaks to it. It's increasingly used to target whistleblowers and journalists like Julian Assange and people who are not in government, but who publish or discuss what the government calls national defense information. And that's another problem with the Espionage Act. This thing is so antiquated that it doesn't even mention the words classified information. It talks about national defense information because the classification system wasn't even invented until the 1950s. And then, to make it even worse, it doesn't even explain what national defense information is. And so over the years, the Justice Department has been able to expand that definition to mean whatever they want it to mean and to go after whistleblowers and journalists. So now the thing has such a broad meaning that you can actually go after a former president who did something very stupid. But there's something to say about prosecutorial discretion, too. And I would say, you know, for the good of the country, do not prosecute Donald Trump. Instead, direct that energy toward rewriting the Espionage Act. And perhaps this might help bring it to a head.
Yeah, and to deal with overclassification and maybe
terrible problem.
You know, to the extent that there might be some gaps in security for these documents as they leave with former administration officials, you could deal with that if it was necessary. But okay, so for the purposes of our conversation, because I think it's important now, and you know, I'm talking to you now, and tomorrow, if this is the news, no matter what we say here is still going to be relevant, and we would probably have a similar exchange. So I'll go ahead and just make sure everybody knows that I didn't get to talk to you about this yet. You know, in the past week, we had the news stories that said that supposedly there was an audio recording and it captured Donald Trump talking about a document that said that these are plans for an attack on Iran, something like that. That he was sharing them with some people. So that apparently got the attention of prosecutors because clearly like that would expose you because you're now sharing the document with people. I think an open question about all the documents in his possession continuously had been, well, weren't they just in boxes and he didn't do anything with them? Right. Or did he actually share the contents with anybody? Because then that would be troubling. But I'm more interested in the political crisis that will be sparked by indicting Donald Trump under the Espionage Act. And I have to put this to you. I put this to some people who might have heard me say this last week when I was streaming on this channel. But, you know, in considering whether Donald Trump would be indicted under the Espionage Act, I said, I don't think that they would. Why? Because I think that the Justice Department knows, and the people who are involved would know, that they are inviting a kind of crisis that would be really hard for them to control. Simply put, because Donald Trump is the leading Republican challenger, it doesn't mean that he should be allowed to commit whatever crimes. It doesn't mean that he shouldn't be held accountable. But when you have all this polling suggesting that Joe Biden is a weak candidate as a Democrat going into the 2024 election, and then the Justice Department goes and indicts him under the Espionage Act and hasn't done so when they could have done it like months ago before it was this close to the primary season. I mean, we're not actually we're almost to the point where we would have debates, and it would be there would be a calendar that would begin to unfold because people start voting in the United States in January.
Yes.
So I'm making a long-winded point here, but to me, I believe, and also this is my preference as a voter, but also I believe that if the Justice Department is going to indict Donald Trump under the Espionage Act because they believe that they have to have accountability, which is a sudden development in this country,
right.
Given what I went through and you went through with the Bush administration and everything. But if that's their position, then I actually firmly believe that Joe Biden has to come out and say he's not running for re-election, and then throw it to Attorney General Merrick Garland and let them do whatever with Donald Trump.
Oh, I think that's a very good point, and a very important point too, because otherwise this looks like political score settling. If Donald Trump were to be indicted under the Espionage Act, at the same time that House Republicans are holding hearings on the politicization of the FBI, and there are wild rumors now that the FBI is planning to assassinate some whistleblower, I'll use air quotes, who's accusing the president of having taken a bribe. I mean, it's just not a good time politically. Now, you said something a minute ago too that's important that I want to come back to. We were talking about the expansion of the use of the Espionage Act. Forgive me if you've heard me tell this story before, but I think it's important enough to be retold. When I was at the CIA in the 1990s, I sat next to a woman who was having an affair with a former CIA officer who had become a CNN talking head. And in the course of pillow talk, she mentioned something to him that was classified. It had to do with Iran, to the best of my recollection. And he repeated that on CNN. The CIA filed a crimes report. The FBI did an investigation, and they immediately focused in on her. And she equally immediately confessed that she had been the source of the information. Now, today, she would be charged with espionage, and she would be facing 10, perhaps 20 years in prison. Back then, she was suspended without pay for 2 weeks. She had a letter of reprimand placed in her personnel file, and she was ineligible for promotion for 1 year. Now, she recovered from that professionally, and she went on to become Senior Intelligence Service Level 4 as director of one of the CIA's major offices. But that's the way to deal with one-time, sometimes accidental leaks, momentary lapses in judgment. They should be dealt with administratively. Today, thanks to the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and the Trump administration, and now apparently the Biden administration, every disclosure of classified information is treated like treason committed on behalf of the Soviet Union. And it's just not. We've got to come up with something more appropriate, something better to handle these disclosures. Who was it? Ilhan Omar, I think, who had drafted
Rashida Tlaib.
Rashida Tlaib, thank you. She had drafted a bill that would replace the Espionage Act. It was fantastic, and I think you and I talked about it at one point.
Mm-hmm.
It never made it out of subcommittee. Never. It never had any prayer of even reaching the floor for a vote. Well, now that the Republicans are in charge in the House, maybe this will make them angry enough that they come to the realization that the Espionage Act is the problem. It's not the solution to the problem, and it needs to be rewritten. We'll see.
Yeah. Though I'm troubled because one could argue, now I understand that one could argue that Barack Obama gave the Espionage Act renewed legitimacy. So what I'm about to say as my point is actually just basically the Biden White House or the Biden Justice Department, sorry, the White House isn't really involved, I would venture to guess, but the Biden Justice Department is just upholding a status quo.
Yes.
That said,
yes.
This legitimizes the Espionage Act to a great extent. Like the idea that you could use it if you're going to use it against a former president. I mean, I think after all that we've discussed and covered, what you went through in your case, because you were convicted or you pled guilty to a charge under the Intelligence Identities Protection Act, but people should know that initially it was an Espionage Act prosecution that was leveled against you, and the sort of abuses of power that can take place under them. I mean, I didn't get to talk to you yet about this either. We will get to the CIA lawsuit. That was the main thing for the video, but this is an important point to make. Recently in Jack Teixeira's case, the Justice Department prosecutors were able to convince the court that even when his father, this is like a 21-year-old person, even when his father was going to step in and put up money and collateral and put him on house arrest and watch him and do all this stuff so that he could be allowed out and not in pretrial detention. Well, they made up all of this. They fabricated all these claims about how he could flee and go sell information to the Russians in order to keep him in pretrial detention. And the judge in the case said, I don't really believe it. It sounds like a spy thriller, but there just might be something to it. So they kept him in detention. And to me, like, that's just a further gross expansion of the power that prosecutors have gained through these cases over the last 15 years.
And it's been very incremental. You recall, Tom Drake was released on his own recognizance. Jeffrey Sterling was released on his own recognizance. I was released on my own recognizance. But in my case, the prosecutor said, Your Honor, when we raided his house, we found 6 passports. Well, yeah, they were all my previous passports that had been invalidated. The State Department punches holes through them. When I apply for a new passport, you send in your old passport, they send you the new one, and then they put stamp void on the old one and punch a hole in it. Well, I've been to 70 countries. A lot of those passports were diplomatic passports that I had from my CIA days, and I saved them as a souvenir. They were in a shoebox. They're not valid for travel. They're not valid for anything because they say void on them. So my lawyers are like, no, he has one valid passport. They took it. The other 6 passports or 5 passports, they left him at the house. So the judge said, yeah, that's ridiculous. She released me on my own recognizance. Reality Winner, however, was charged in, what was it, Texas? Atlanta, something like that. This was a very conservative court with a conservative judge, and they asked that she be held pending trial because she was a national security threat. Well, of course she was not a national security threat. All of us are professionals. We were all released on our own recognizance. But the judge down there set the precedent of holding her over for trial. And now that has become the norm. So Jack Teixeira is going to be in prison probably for a very long time from now through trial. And then once he's convicted, which I think he probably will be, and sentenced, onward. But now I would venture to say that it's going to be very hard if you've been charged with a national security crime to not stay out of, or to not be incarcerated. It's going to be very hard to be released on bail. And I can't imagine anybody being released on their own recognizance anymore.
Yeah. And even though this is a nonviolent crime, I mean, you're like leaking is there's no violence if you post this classified information. Although I suppose, within these national security agencies, they would say by posting it, people could get killed because of the information. But they
always say that.
This was in Augusta, Georgia, and they were arguing that reality winner was like a Taliban sympathizer just because she had the skills to translate Dari, Pashto, and Farsi.
Right.
And because she had an interest in going to like a Syrian refugee camp or going to Afghanistan to help people who were displaced and impacted by the actual war on terrorism, in which she was helping to facilitate in the Air Force, which I think is really admirable.
Oh
right?
my
Like
gosh, yes.
the humanitarian impulse of like, after I fulfill my mission, I would like to go help people who are the collateral damage of what we're doing. So anyways, I didn't intend to spend this much time on this, but it's just, it seems like everyone's gung ho for justice with Donald Trump, and that's fine. I wish it wouldn't come this way, and I guess I know that there are two other cases that are unfolding. I guess all three of them are going to be brought at the same time, which is rather incredible.
I agree with you. The New York case, attorney friends of mine have told me, is weak. The Georgia election case, these same attorney friends tell me, is strong. I think this would be an incredible time for Joe Biden to issue a pardon to Donald Trump and then demand that Congress take up the Espionage Act and rewrite it from the bottom to the top.
All right, so let's go to what I want to discuss, which is the fact that there is this lawsuit against alleged CIA spying. And I don't really have to say alleged, but I just keep doing it as a journalist. But let me just go ahead and put up here. I want to read the explosive revelation that we have now, why I don't have to say alleged. Before we get to the lawsuit itself, let me share what we know from El Pais now. And I'm talking to John Kiriakou, former CIA officer and whistleblower. And this is the first time we've talked about this major revelation. But what we have now is that on the computer of David Morales, the UC global director who was involved in some arrangement, we don't know all the details yet, some things still to be confirmed, but had some arrangement to target and do surveillance of the Ecuador embassy. And what we find in this article is that on his laptop computer, there was a folder that was labeled CIA. And actually, there's a CIA appears several times on his external hard drive. And all this data, there's over 250 gigabytes of files, by the way. That's a lot of information. 213. The police provided a copy of data on his computer to attorneys in this parallel case that's been unfolding in Spain, where Julian Assange and his legal team challenged privacy offenses that were committed against him while he was in the embassy. This has been going on, and they've discovered that they're missing over 200 gigabytes of data, and the judge in that case allowed them to go back to the computer and look at it again. And on it, you find, I'll just read some of this text here that nobody can make out on this video, which is that there's an operations and projects folder. There are directories according to geographical area. There's an area that corresponds to North America within a USA directory. And then there's the file called CIA. Inside, there's a folder marked videos that has images of recordings that are stored. There were obtained, these were from hidden cameras and microphones installed in the embassy. Each recording is dated, titled. Some are like Pamela Anderson, which is she was meeting and was a friend of Assange. Then there's like guest. So it'd be the name that Morales employed to use to refer to Assange. Then there's ladies' toilet. Yes. Yeah. You may not have heard all the details in the story. There was a particular bug or camera or an audio device that was installed in the ladies' restroom at the Ecuador embassy. Then there's Fidel, and that's Fidel Narvaez. He was the Ecuadorian consul who was trying to get Julian Assange a diplomatic passport to leave the embassy. So now we don't have to speak in these like broad, circumspect ways. Right. We actually have evidence. And like what the attorney Richard Roth for these journalists and attorneys have been saying is that, you know, you're not just going, like nobody just has files on their computer marked CIA while they're engaged in a surveillance operation against the Ecuador embassy or while they're doing security for a foreign embassy. Like, it would be very bizarre if that was just like him doing his own research, or he was just like had some passionate interest in the CIA.
Oh, you're absolutely right. This is highly irregular for a couple of reasons. First of all, you have to assume that this information being surreptitiously collected is classified, and it's just on his regular old laptop computer. Like, should this information, if it were, you know, collected on behalf of the CIA, he would be what's called a coder, a COTR. It's, I forget what it stands for, but it's a contractor. You turn over all of the information to the contracting agency, which would be the CIA, and you're not allowed to keep any of it, not a scrap of it, on your own computer. It has to be all returned to the agency, number one. Number two, and this is something that disturbs me very, very much. When El Pais first broke this story, more than a year ago, I think now, I consulted with a friend of ours, Bruce Fine, who's an eminent constitutional scholar, attorney, former professor at Harvard Law School, and Associate Deputy Attorney General of the United States. And I said, how in the world can the Justice Department, first of all, justify collecting the information in the embassy, the Ecuadorian embassy, the way they did, and legally use it in a court of law? And he said, oh, no, you're wrong. He said, the Supreme Court ruled on this decades ago, that if an intelligence operation conducted overseas against a foreign national is carried out with the use of bugs, electronic surveillance, video surveillance, whatever it is, it's all admissible, because the Supreme Court said that that person, that target, does not have a right to privacy in the US court system. I had never heard that before, but that's what Julian is going to be up against. All of this information, dreadful, disgusting, the way it was collected, it's all going to be legally used against him if he were to come to the United States to face this this trial. And it just points to the unfairness of the entire system. You know, this is another one of those situations where it would be a win for everybody if the Biden administration were to negotiate a plea, sentence Julian to time served, which has been substantial, declare victory, and let the man go home. And that way you don't have to worry about defending yourself in a suit brought by the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or any other journalist who would then be liable for prosecution.
All right. I don't disagree with that. And let me just take a moment and say, for anybody tuning in, if you've got any questions or any comments in particular for us, go ahead and leave those in the chat, and be happy to fold them into our discussion here about this lawsuit. But so that's Assange. I assume that everything you're saying, well, maybe you're actually also referring to people who visited Assange as well. But what you were saying to me sounds like what Julian will have to deal with if he's on U.S. trial. If he's on trial in the United States, and as he's being prosecuted by the Justice Department, and he wants to argue, okay, you don't have a right to pursue this because you violated my rights by spying on me. You took my attorney-client privileged information. You did all. You're saying that, well, according to this case in the Supreme Court, he'd have a really tough time getting all that thrown out.
And let me add one thing too, and forgive me if I'm getting a little bit too far down in the weeds, but you raised an important point here about what happens when an American is the other side of the conversation. So Pam Anderson, she was originally Canadian, but now she's American. Brad Birkenfeld met several times with Julian Assange in London. Brad's an American. Lots and lots of Americans visited Julian in the embassy. So what happens to them? You can collect the information legally, so long as the American isn't the target of the indictment or the indictment to be.
Right.
And then if that information is going to be used in court, where you need both sides of the conversation to make the case, the name of the person is redacted, and that person would be referred to as U.S. person number 1, U.S. person number 2. That's how they get around it. And let me add,
Right.
Bungled and Botched just made a comment. It was a diplomatic building. Yes, it was. And that's also an important point. This was all done with the cooperation of the Ecuadorian government. Shame on them for what they did.
So I believe they were cooperating, but I think that there's still some, like, we don't actually know how much David Morales was cluing in some parts of the Ecuadorian government into what was going on. Like, I don't know if we can say that Lenin Moreno, who was the president then of Ecuador, knew what his security agency was. It's called Senain, right?
Yeah, it is. I think he did know, though, because
okay,
as soon as this information became public, and I mean within days of this information becoming public, the U.S. and Ecuador announced a major trade deal, and it was billions of dollars.
It was a loan. It was an IMF loan.
So that's what it was, an IMF loan. That's right, not a trade deal. So I think that was the quid pro quo.
Yeah. All right. So you said something important, which was if it's incidental, then they can get away with it. So a key argument in the response from the attorney. So let me first establish basic details here. So this lawsuit is being brought by 4 Americans. So none of these people who visited, unfortunately, there's really no redress for anyone from any European countries, Asian countries. Like Ai Weiwei couldn't get any redress if he had visited Assange in the embassy. Africans, there were people like that who visited Julian Assange. Anyone Australian, anyone from Latin America, not really anything that they can do. But there are people who in the United States could try to bring this lawsuit. At least that's what Richard Roth and other attorneys working with him at this law firm believe. And so you've got Margaret Ratner Kunstler, who is an attorney that was involved in representing Assange.
In fact, she met with Julian last weekend at Belmarsh.
Exactly. Yes.
To discuss this issue.
Yep. And then Deborah Herbeck is a media lawyer. And then John Getz was with Der Spiegel. And Charles Glass was a journalist who visited Julian Assange and at some point or another has written some articles about Assange for The Intercept. And all 4 of them are bringing this, and there's potentially hundreds, if not 1,000 Americans who visited Julian Assange over the time that he was in the Ecuador embassy. Did you visit Julian Assange?
No, the Brits wouldn't let me in.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, but you tried.
I tried.
But so this thing of the incidental. So, in the filing that was just submitted in response to the CIA, they make a big point about that, and the response that Richard Roth and the plaintiffs, all these attorneys and journalists give is basically that it can't be incidental. It can't be incidental because they knew that these people were going into the embassy and that they had identified themselves as Americans. So it can't be like a oopsie, we happen to target somebody who's American talking to Julian Assange. And they, beyond the eavesdropping itself, they say, quote, CIA and Pompeo downloaded the contents of plaintiffs' electronic devices after they identified themselves as American citizens and prior to meeting with Assange.
Yeah.
And that also, at the time, they had provided their passports, they've identified themselves as Americans, and they've passed through a security checkpoint. Another thing that I thought was remarkable too is I'll let you respond to both of these points. So there's the one about whether it's incidental or not, which I think it can't be called incidental. But then the other thing is they've said they don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy because they should have known he was a national security target.
Mm-hmm.
But I actually think that this is a pretty decent argument that they're trying here. I'd like to get your reaction. I'm not sure that you know about this, that they're going to try in the court. But basically, they want to say at that time when they met Julian Assange, it was the end of 2017. It were the first few January 2017 to March 2018 is the time period in which UC Global and the CIA is believed to have been partnered in targeting Assange. Mm-hmm. And what they say in their response to the CIA and Pompeo is that they had a reasonable expectation that their devices were not going to be rifled through and downloaded and copied because they were meeting with Assange, because everything that Julian Assange is accused of doing pertains to mostly 2010, some parts of 2011. Most of the indictment is all about that. So why in 2017 would you think that there's an ongoing investigation in which you yourselves are going to be targeted and surveilled by, at that point, he's there in the embassy. And I think we can recall what it was like at that time. It was sort of like there's just this cloud hanging over Julian Assange. And we believe that if he leaves the embassy, he won't be safe. But we don't exactly know what he wouldn't be safe from, because we don't know what they're going to bring as far as charges against Julian Assange.
Right. Wow, where do we even start to unpack this one? First of all, you're absolutely right. And I think the argument is correct that it's illegal for the CIA through the Ecuadorians or the British or whomever else. It's illegal for the CIA to take the cell phones of American citizens or any U.S. person that's an American citizen or a person who has a U.S. green card and download the data without specific legal authorization to do that in the form of a warrant or a court order. You can't do that. Americans do have an expectation of privacy from the American government. Unless you are an active target of a national security investigation, they can't do that. They can't take your cell phone and download your data. I'm not sure why they would want to take the data of anybody else to learn what? That they were using Signal to text Julian and wish him well and ask how his day was. I mean, what do they hope to gain from something like that? Is it really worth the legal effort, the hoops that you have to jump for to make this legal and acceptable? I think that's a big mistake. With that said, I think we underestimate the dangerousness and the damage that Mike Pompeo caused. Mike Pompeo, in my view, is not this legitimate mainstream conservative former congressman and Secretary of State and CIA director. The guy was a rogue. He was a rogue and a would-be murderer who bragged about lying and cheating and stealing and bugging and eavesdropping, and who laid out a plan to murder Julian Assange in broad daylight were he to ever leave the Ecuadorian embassy. You remember, and I think we did have this conversation once before, you remember Pompeo using the term hostile non-state actor, right? He used that term on purpose. There's a very specific legal reason why you would use a term like that. Because any covert action program that the CIA is considering has to be briefed by law. It has to be briefed at least to the Gang of Four. That's the chairman and vice chairman of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. In most cases, it's supposed to be briefed to all of the members of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, unless it's a counterintelligence covert operation. That's why he said that WikiLeaks was a non-state counterintelligence hostile actor. Because if it's a counterintelligence operation, the idea behind it is maybe the chairman and vice chairman of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees are the moles that are the targets ultimately of the investigation. Maybe the House and Senate Intelligence Committee chairmen are working with Julian Assange to steal American secrets. And of course, that's preposterous, but that's the idea. And then if you invoke that language, you don't have to brief anybody. Somebody asked me once, I don't remember which outlet, where I thought consideration of that operation ended. And after giving it a lot of thought, I think it ended with the National Security Advisor, General, I forget his name, one of Trump's many national security advisors. Because the way these things go, somebody at the CIA thinks up the operation. Hey, I have an idea for an operation. Let's kill Julian Assange. That goes to something called the CAS, the Covert Action Staff. And they put it in the right format and they make sure all the boxes are ticked. They're clerks for the most part. Then it goes to the CIA's Office of the General Counsel to see if it's legal. And the General Counsel always says, yes, this is legal. Then it goes to the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, OLC. They're the ones that approved of the torture program. So OLC says, yes, this is legal. From there, it goes to the General Counsel at the National Security Council at the White House. And they approve it. Yes, this is legal. Then it goes to the National Security Advisor. If the National Security Advisor signs it, it goes to the president for his signature. And then it's implemented. We know that it didn't get to Trump. I would bet a paycheck that it made its way all through the legal process. And then when it got to the National Security Advisor, he said, are you people insane? This is a Five Eyes citizen, an Australian national, and you want to murder him in the capital of a major NATO country? We're not doing this. And I think that's the only reason it wasn't implemented.
So Deborah Herbeck said today during the press conference that in Mike Pompeo's memoir, or his book that he feebly tried to position himself as a front-running presidential candidate for 2024. Now we know he's not going to run for president, but in Never Give an Inch, which I don't know, did you crack open any of that just to see, like, being morbidly curious about what were on any of these pages? I actually went and got it from my local library just so I could find what he had written on WikiLeaks. There's 2.5 pages. But I missed this, and I missed this because it's not in the section apparently where he discusses WikiLeaks. But apparently on December 23rd, 2017, he writes that he was sitting around with his family and he was going through the guidelines for extrajudicial killings at the CIA. Which is bizarre because that's not really what I do around Christmas. I don't know about you, but I'm not like that engaged in murder. But he was doing this. And at the same time, people should know that UC Global had helped the CIA and Justice Department and other parts of the US government learn that there was a plan underway between Ecuador and Assange's legal team to confer him diplomatic status so that he could leave the Ecuador embassy on Christmas Day and go to Ecuador, finally, hop in a plane. I think he was going to leave through I think they call it a European tunnel. And he was going to go through and finally get out of the effective prison in which he had been living for the last, it would have been more than 5 years. Mm-hmm. And so it's just, it aligns too perfectly. And when you throw in the Yahoo News reporting, which is what you're talking about there, the sketched war plans, and like to me, I'm as somebody who has no connection at all to any national security agency, but has just read history. I just see what has been written and alleged and reported about Mike Pompeo. And I just think like, oh, here's a guy who almost got to be part of, an assassination operation, which was pretty standard in the 1950s and 60s. And he was probably wanted to be involved. I mean, we know he wanted to be involved in that kind of. His book is all about how when he stepped into the CIA, he wanted to like remove the guardrails that had been imposed by the Obama White House, even though I know that those guardrails were probably very, very modest, if there were even anything done. He makes it seem like they were supposed to handle everything with kid gloves.
Yeah, there were no guardrails imposed during the Obama administration. 9/11 changed so much at the CIA. There were no extrajudicial killings authorized between 1975 and 2001. There was a killing in Lebanon that was done by the Mossad on behalf of the CIA in the 1990s, but that was it. 9/11 changed everything. The president issued an executive order allowing for extrajudicial killings again. The CIA set up several different units. I won't go into the details, of course, but several different units that were authorized to carry out these assassinations. But the rules were very, very clear. And the vast majority of them were by drone, right? And they were against mostly Arab individuals, some Central and South Asians in these isolated villages by drone. Handful of kidnappings where special forces guys rappel down from a helicopter, snatch a guy, and then a van speeds them off. Very unusual. But those people had to present a clear and present danger to the safety and security of the United States and of American citizens and facilities, I think is the other word. There's no way. There's just no possible way they could ever make a legal argument that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks posed a clear and imminent danger to the United States, to the safety and security of Americans and American installations. It can't happen. So for Pompeo to say that he was sitting around going over the rules for extrajudicial killings, first, shame on him. Second, as murderous as you might like to be, you can't be in this situation. You just can't.
Yeah. I mean, there's something very wrong with Mike Pompeo. I mean, from the fact that, I mean, I know that other people have done it. I've said this before on this channel, but I'll just repeat it because I have to be merciless when it comes to Mike Pompeo. I have no restraint because I think that if an individual like that got any closer to the levers of power again, like if he was ever in a powerful position again, I mean, he would continue to bring about destruction. He's not, he doesn't hide it.
No.
So here's a sociopath who bought up like nearly 50,000 copies of his book just so he could get it on the New York Times bestseller list. I know that people have done that before and that's a system. But just, his book didn't sell. Nobody wanted to read about him. It turns out that what he did at the CIA and State Department was not compelling to a lot of people. They just didn't really care.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make him a person that can run for president. And so he's now worse off. The other thing I never understood, and like it speaks to like how you can't trust someone, is something happened. He lost a bunch of weight and he lied to us about it. I think I might have said this to you before, but he lied to us. And I don't know why he felt that he had to lie, because if you have an operation or a surgery or whatever, I mean, then, nobody's going to think less of you.
No, God bless. I hope it saves your health.
But he
But
puts
you don't
out
need
there
to
that
lie
he's
about
gone.
it.
He puts out there that he's gone through some fitness regime, or like he's eating taking a new diet or whatever. Well, it looks unhealthy. You've lost 125 pounds. What are you doing?
Yeah, I'll tell you another thing too, and I hope this isn't getting too far off the subject. But I've got a good
No.
friend. I've got a good friend who works in the CIA's Office of Security, and he was assigned as one of Mike Pompeo's bodyguards for the entire duration of the Pompeo tenure at CIA. And he said that the only person at the CIA who was more universally reviled than Mike Pompeo was Mrs. Mike Pompeo, who would literally snap her fingers and say, "You," to the bodyguards, "You, go get my dry cleaning. You, take my dog for a walk." And they would have to tell her, "Mrs. Pompeo, with all due respect, we don't work for you. And even if we did, we don't go get dry cleaning and walk your dog. That's not what we're here for."
So I see somebody asking, and I do just so happen to be able to fulfill requests if people ask for this greatest hit from Mike Pompeo. So I'll play it as we wind down or begin to wind down our conversation. So yes, this is Mike Pompeo's classic quote.
Cadet. What's the cadet motto at West Point? You will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses.
There you go.
I mean, if you hear that, you don't have to doubt that they were going to be involved in a spying operation against Assange, and they were willing to incapacitate him. I mean, like, why would you think that they wouldn't, as upset that they were that their files were splashed around on the internet? I don't see them wanting to hold back when it comes to revenge. So when you have people like the journalists and attorneys that I mentioned who become caught up in this as they're visiting, I mean, they don't have to be. You're right. You make a good point. Like, what do they really have to offer? I suppose they were trying to see if there were any more plans to help Julian Assange escape the embassy. I think that's what they really wanted to know, but I don't know. The other thing is that I do like this line in the filing. The search and seizure herein would have never taken place absent defendant Pompeo's orders and murderous obsession with Assange. So without, wanting to, put Julian Assange's head on a pike, Pompeo is probably not going to authorize any of this. But, when you're so driven for revenge, that's when you see people in these agencies willing to take risks. And now we could really broaden out, and we don't have time for this long conversation, but I think that's why we're seeing things happen in Ukraine that make you go, how could anybody greenlight that? How could anyone approve that? But then it seems the people who are involved in the national security agencies have such a zealous dislike for Russia that they don't have any boundaries for what they're authorizing. So you can compare that to Assange and just say that when people don't have any limits or boundaries for what they're willing to authorize, then that's when, we get into scenarios that aren't just going to have repercussions for the people who are targeted, but like all of us, like what kinds of fallout will happen, nuclear or non-nuclear, that we then have to deal with.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We've put ourselves as a government, as a country, we've put ourselves in a corner on this. And as tight a fit as it is, I think there's still an opportunity to get out and for everybody to save face. We know, for example, that Prime Minister, what's his first name? Anthony Albanese of Australia has said several times publicly that he will raise the issue of Julian Assange in every conversation with every American government official at every level. U.S. Ambassador to Australia, Caroline Kennedy, just recently did a photo op and had a meeting with more than a half a dozen Australian parliamentarians of all political parties, acknowledging for the first time that Julian Assange has near universal support in Australia. across the ideological spectrum. We know that the European Court of Human Rights is still willing to consider Julian's case in the event that he loses his appeal in the British High Court. He's been, for all intents and purposes, incarcerated for what now, 13 years? Something like that?
Yeah.
13 years. Okay, let the man take a plea to whatever. It doesn't make any difference. Time served, and he's expelled from the UK back to Australia.
Yep.
And then we all move on. I mean, I just don't know why this conversation isn't farther down the road. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. And I want to wind down here, and I'll let you tell people where they can find your work. But I think,
thank you.
You know, if we can acknowledge, I mean, everything we talk about sounds like we're not capable of winning. And because these people, you know, there is no accountability unless for some reason, you know, the game shifts as it is shifting against Donald Trump in such a way that we might see something extraordinary where, I don't know, 1, 2 indictments. I don't know how many indictments could happen, but clearly it seems like prosecutors aren't willing to keep their hands off that. When it was off limits to indict Dick Cheney, it was off limits to indict anybody involved in torture, but apparently it's not off limits. It's not a political hot potato to go after Donald Trump, in their opinion, which I disagree with. But you know, they are they're going to make their own calculations. But I think we have to acknowledge the groundswell of support that has been going around the world. And I'll let you final word, but I just want to very quickly just give people the overview that we've seen letters from Mexico. We've seen letters from Brazil. There's been progressive leaders in Latin America that have written their own letter. There's parliamentarians in the UK, parliamentarians in Australia. You're referring to that meeting. Joe Biden still has to go to Australia because he canceled his trip during the debt ceiling hostage thing that we all just witnessed and watched. But he'll go back there, and when he goes there, he's going to meet with Albanese and have to at least privately address this. AMLO or Obrador, the president of Mexico, met with Biden and raised this issue. I mean, I never would have thought that the Mexican president would be the one pressuring Joe Biden to drop these charges against Julian Assange. We've seen the State Department have to take a position on the case. I don't know. I didn't talk about this with you, but the last thing I'll say here before throwing it to you for your closing, whatever you want to say in closing, is that when the deputy spokesperson was asked, how do you square the fact that Evan Gershkovich is in jail, and you keep saying that it's wrong for the Russians to go after him for collecting state secrets, when you have Julian Assange in a UK prison because he was collecting state secrets? So isn't that hypocritical? How can you condemn that while you're jailing a journalist? And the State Department saw that they had no ability to really claim the moral high ground. It was getting harder to talk about the issue. And on World Press Freedom Day, when they're asked by Associated Press journalist Matthew Lee, they just cave and go. They go to some boilerplate nonsense from 2010 where they say, we think that Julian Assange is being investigated for something very serious. The criminal allegations are serious. We take in a position that he endangered people's lives and that he put people at risk. And they just sound like they're repeating something that they went to the archives and found from the Pentagon press secretary back in 2010.
Yes, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. We've gotten to the point where this case has progressed so much that the rubber has finally hit the road or met the road, whatever the phrase is. And the government realizes that it doesn't have a coordinated message. It doesn't really know, at least various parts of it don't really know what position they're supposed to have on Julian Assange, because the position that they do have is hypocritical, as you say. You know, if we're gonna criticize the Russians for Evan Gershkovich, then we have to do something about Julian Assange.
Oh, and sorry, let me interject that there's an
Yeah.
Indian reporter for Defense News that the Indian government has imprisoned on the same. It's exactly the same as what they're doing to Evan.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Now's the time for us to clean up our act. Yeah. And I know we're short on time, so I'm going to say I put all my writing on Substack, John Kiriakou, and I'm on Twitter, Facebook. And yeah, thanks. This was fun.
All right. Well, it's good to talk with you. I like checking in with you periodically
I enjoy
to
it.
update the viewers and people who follow this work so that they can get the insights that you have on the Espionage Act and what's happening with secrecy and
Thank you.
whistleblowing and all of that. So we'll check in with each other in the next couple of months. But I have to end by saying, if anybody gets to this part of the video and you are in the Arlington, Virginia or DC area, that you should come out on June 18th in the evening on Sunday and hear us have further discussion because we'll be talking about my book, which I'm just going to take the opportunity
an excellent book it is.
And oh, by the way, people will enjoy, I'll do this at the book discussion as well, but there was sort of a thing that my publisher did to where you're actually in here twice. Oh. Your blurb appears twice. So I just would like to thank you for your double blurb that is in the book.
Great.
So everyone, thank you for tuning in. And I'll be back next week with some more updates on all of this news. But until next time, you all take care of yourselves. And thank you again, John, for joining.
Thank you, Kevin.